Number 1. Warren Jeffs. Warren Jeffs wasn't just a religious leader. Inside the fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, he was treated like a prophet whose word outranked the law, basic morality, and even parental authority. And he used that power to turn an entire community into his cover for systematic child abuse. Jeffs grew up as the son of Rulon Jeffs, the powerful FLDS prophet who controlled compounds in Utah and Arizona. From a young age, Warren was groomed for authority. He ran the FLDS school, controlled education, and enforced strict separation from the outside world. Followers believed that obeying him meant obeying God, and disobeying meant losing your family, your home, and your salvation. When his father's health declined, Warren stepped in. By the time Rulon died in 2002, Warren had already positioned himself as the only legitimate successor. He seized control of church assets, took over housing, and even reassigned wives and children from men he considered unworthy. If he removed you from favor, you didn't just lose status, you could lose your entire family overnight. Under Warren Jeffs, the FLDS became even more isolated and extreme. Women and girls were expected to be obedient, modest, and silent. Boys who questioned him or showed rebellious behavior could be kicked out of the community and left with nothing. But Jeffs' most sinister actions were hidden behind sacred language: spiritual marriages, plural wives, celestial unions. In reality, he was arranging illegal marriages between grown men and underage girls, some as young as 12 or 13. He preached that entering these marriages was a commandment from God, and that resisting meant defying heaven itself. Under that pressure, families handed their daughters over, believing they were securing blessings rather than enabling abuse. By the mid-2000s, law enforcement in multiple states was looking closely at the FLDS. Former members began speaking out about child brides and coercive control. One case in particular, involving a 14-year-old girl forced to marry her older cousin, gave prosecutors a concrete path to charge Jeffs. But when authorities tried to bring him in, he vanished. In May 2006, the FBI added Warren Jeffs to its 10 most wanted list, alongside terrorists and violent fugitives. His charges weren't for explosives or mass shootings. They were for arranging the rape of children under the disguise of religion. That move told the world how seriously investigators viewed his crimes. While on the run, Jeffs leaned on his network of loyal followers. They gave him vehicles, money, safe houses, and burner phones. He constantly moved between FLDS communities in Utah, Arizona, and Texas, and used multiple identities. From inside the cult, he was still treated like a prophet in exile. From the outside, he was a fugitive using faith as a shield. The way he was finally caught was almost embarrassingly simple. On August 28, 2006, a Nevada Highway Patrol trooper pulled over a red Cadillac Escalade near Las Vegas for a routine traffic violation. Inside were Warren Jeffs, his brother, and one of his wives. What should have been a minor traffic stop turned into the end of a manhunt. Troopers quickly realized who they had. In the SUV, they found wigs and disguises, multiple cell phones, and around $55,000 in cash. For someone claiming to be a humble religious prophet, he was traveling like a career criminal who knew capture was coming. The arrest was a turning point. For the first time, the man who'd controlled thousands of lives was physically in custody and facing real consequences. The legal cases that followed exposed how deep the abuse went. In one major trial, prosecutors focused on the forced marriage of a 14-year-old girl to her 19-year-old cousin, framed by Jeffs as a religious ceremony. Jeffs didn't just allow it. He arranged it, ordered it, and used his status as prophet to pressure everyone involved. Victims and former followers described a closed world where they had no meaningful choice. Saying no to Warren Jeffs meant losing family, home, and eternal salvation. That level of control is what turned his actions from individual crimes into systemic abuse. Eventually, Jeffs was convicted in state court for his role in the sexual assault of underage girls he called wives. Sentences stacked up to effectively ensure he would never walk free again. In Texas, he received a life sentence plus additional decades, guaranteeing he will die behind bars. Even after his imprisonment, he tried to issue revelations and directives from his cell, but the spell was broken. The world now saw him not as a prophet, but as a predator who weaponized faith. Today, Warren Jeffs sits in prison as a reminder of how far unchecked religious authority can go when no one is allowed to question it. The FLDS community is fractured. Many former members are still trying to rebuild their lives, and survivors continue to process what was done to them in the name of God. And while Jeffs' arrest ended his physical control, 2006 was full of other cases where a single person's actions left entire communities in shock. Next up is number 2, where a quiet Labor Day weekend at a small Maine inn turned into a nightmare of blood, dismemberment, and a quadruple murder that no one saw coming. Number 2, Christian Charles Nielsen. Christian Charles Nielsen wasn't a career criminal. He wasn't on anyone's radar. He was a quiet, socially withdrawn 31-year-old line cook at a small restaurant in Maine. But over one Labor Day weekend in 2006, he carried out one of the most shocking and senseless killing sprees in the state's history. 4 dead. 3 dismembered. No motive that ever made real sense. Just sudden, explosive violence. Nielsen lived alone in a rented cabin near the Black Bear Bed and Breakfast in Newry. The owner, 65-year-old Julie Bullard, let him stay on her property, and he'd been around her family for years. From the outside, he looked like an introvert, maybe troubled, but nothing that suggested a massacre was coming. But internally, he was spiraling. He had a long history of depression, isolation, and dark fantasies he kept private. On September 3rd, 2006, everything broke. His first victim was James Whitehurst, a 50-year-old guest staying at the bed and breakfast. Nielsen shot him and dragged the body outside. Instead of panicking or running, he calmly went back to his usual routine. And that's the part investigators later struggled with. He didn't show signs of rage or panic. He acted like someone checking off a to-do list. The next morning, Julie Bullard arrived at the property. She noticed Whitehurst's body and confronted Nielsen. Instead of giving an explanation or running, Nielsen shot her too. This wasn't an argument or a moment of passion. It was a continuation of something he'd already committed to in his mind. Hours later, Julie's daughter, 30-year-old Selby Bullard, came looking for her mother. Nielsen killed her as well. At this point, there were 3 bodies connected to the same small property, and Nielsen didn't stop. The 4th victim, 43-year-old Cindy Beatson, was a friend helping the Bullard family move. She walked into the wrong place at the wrong time and paid with her life. She didn't even know Nielsen. He didn't know her. The common thread between all 4 victims was proximity. They were simply there. What came next was the most disturbing part. Nielsen dismembered 3 of the bodies using a chainsaw, hacksaw, and an axe. He burned remains, moved pieces around the property, and behaved with a level of detachment that convinced investigators he wasn't acting out of rage. He was methodical. When police finally showed up after a missing persons report, Nielsen didn't run or hide. He confessed on the spot. Not only did he admit everything, but he expressed no remorse and offered no coherent motive. His explanation drifted from paranoia to vague ideas about wanting to put people out of their misery. Nothing he said matched the brutality of what he did. Forensic psychologists later concluded that Nielsen had been deteriorating mentally for years. Social isolation, untreated mental health issues, and violent fantasies had built up in silence. And because he wasn't involved in crime, had no major incidents, and lived quietly, no one saw the implosion coming. Nielsen pleaded guilty in October 2006. No trial, no insanity defense, no attempt to justify it. The judge handed him 4 concurrent life sentences. For the victims' families, the case ended quickly, but the impact of the killings still lingers in Maine's collective memory. This wasn't a territorial dispute, a domestic conflict, or a crime rooted in greed. It was violence from a man who snapped quietly but catastrophically. 4 people died because Nielsen's internal world finally ruptured into the real one. And the next case shows the opposite dynamic. Not a loner with no power, but a former dictator whose crimes were so extensive that his final judgment became one of the most watched court decisions of 2006. Number 3. Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein's downfall wasn't a sudden collapse. It was the final stage of a decades-long rule defined by fear, repression, and absolute control. By the time he faced a courtroom in 2006, the world had already seen the scale of his brutality. But the trial and execution that year became one of the most consequential moments in modern political history. Before everything unraveled, Saddam built his power through the Ba'ath Party and rose to Iraq's presidency in 1979. From his first day in office, he ruled through intimidation. Dissent was crushed, opposition parties were destroyed, and entire communities lived under the threat of secret police, torture chambers, and disappearances. For many Iraqis, life under Saddam meant survival by silence. The trigger for his 2006 conviction centered on one specific event, the 1982 Dujail massacre. After a failed assassination attempt against him during a visit to the town of Dujail, Saddam ordered a sweeping retaliation. 148 Shiite men and boys were executed. Hundreds more were imprisoned, tortured, or forced into exile. Their orchards and farmland were bulldozed as punishment. For years, these killings were just one chapter among many. His regime carried out campaigns against the Kurds, crushed uprisings with mass executions, and used chemical weapons on civilians. But when Saddam was captured by U.S. forces in December 2003, the international legal system had to choose: try him for every crime, or focus on the clearest, most documented case. They chose the second path. The Dujail trial was intense, chaotic, and broadcast worldwide. Saddam refused to acknowledge the court's legitimacy. He interrupted proceedings, argued with judges, and insisted he was still Iraq's rightful president. But the testimony from survivors, documents signed in his own handwriting, and the regime's records left little to contest. On November 5, 2006, the court issued the verdict: guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to death by hanging. The announcement triggered celebrations in parts of Iraq and outrage in others. Even among global observers, opinions were split. Some viewed the trial as overdue justice. Others saw it as a rushed and politically influenced process. But the sentence stood. On December 30th, 2006, just before dawn, Saddam Hussein was executed. He remained defiant to the end, refusing a hood and speaking religious declarations as the noose was placed over his neck. The execution was recorded on a cell phone, leaked within hours, and quickly spread worldwide. Instead of a sterile state event, it became a raw and controversial moment that defined how many people remember his final minutes. His death didn't heal Iraq. If anything, it left a power vacuum that accelerated conflict. But the execution marked a symbolic end to one of the most oppressive regimes of the late 20th century. For the families of the Dujail victims, it closed a chapter. For historians, It raised questions about justice, stability, and the consequences of removing a dictator by force. And while Saddam's case involved a nation and decades of atrocities, the next story swings back to the deeply personal. Number 4 focuses on a serial predator whose crimes destroyed an Idaho family, left a child as the lone survivor, and revealed the true nature of a man investigators once underestimated. Number 4. Joseph Edward Duncan III. Joseph Edward Duncan III is one of the most unsettling offenders in modern U.S. criminal history, not because of a single crime, but because of a lifelong pattern of violence that escalated every time he was released back into society. By 2006, his name became synonymous with a case that shocked law enforcement across multiple states and left one child as the only survivor of a devastating attack on an Idaho family. Duncan's background reads like a long series of missed warning signs. He spent much of his life cycling in and out of prisons for serious crimes, and each release led to behavior that was increasingly dangerous. Despite a clear history of violent offending, he managed to move freely across the country with very little oversight. In May 2005, Duncan focused on the Groene family home in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Inside were 40-year-old Brenda Groene, her 13-year-old son Slade, her fiancé Mark McKenzie, and Brenda's 2 youngest children, Shasta and Dylan. For reasons that investigators were never able to fully explain, Duncan targeted this family specifically. On May 15th, he entered the home and carried out a series of acts that resulted in the deaths of the 3 adults. Instead of fleeing the scene, he took the 2 youngest children and disappeared across state lines. What followed was a massive search effort that lasted nearly 7 weeks. During this time, investigators were working around the clock, combing through possible sightings, interstate travel records, and abandoned campsites, hoping for any trace that the 2 missing children were still alive. The case became one of the most urgent active investigations in the nation. The turning point came on July 2, 2005. In a moment that stunned the public, 8-year-old Shasta walked into a Denny's restaurant in Coeur d'Alene, accompanied by Duncan. A waitress immediately recognized her from the widely circulated photos. Police responded instantly, arrested Duncan, and recovered Shasta safely. Her return was described by investigators as extraordinary. She became the key witness in helping authorities understand what happened during the weeks she and her brother were missing. Tragically, it was confirmed that 9-year-old Dylan had not survived. The evidence against Duncan was overwhelming. In October 2006, he pleaded guilty in Idaho to the murders of Brenda, Slade, and Mark, avoiding a prolonged trial. He received multiple life sentences. Later, in federal court, he was sentenced to death for the kidnapping that resulted in Dylan's death. Even after his conviction, investigators linked Duncan to additional cases across multiple states, showing that his pattern of violence extended back many years. His criminal history became one of the clearest examples of how repeated release decisions can fail to protect the public from highly dangerous offenders. Duncan died in federal custody in 2021 after being diagnosed with terminal cancer. Shasta Groene, the sole survivor, has since spoken publicly about her experience with strength that few people could imagine. Her survival remains the only light in a case defined by tragedy. Next is number 5, where a high-profile retrial ended with a verdict that still sparks national debate about mental health and criminal responsibility. Number 5, Andrea Yates. Andrea Yates is one of the most debated defendants in modern American criminal history, not because the facts were unclear, but because the central question was whether her mind was intact enough to understand her actions in 2001. Her 2006 retrial became the defining moment of that debate, forcing the country to face how catastrophic untreated mental illness can become when it intersects with parenthood, pressure, and silence. Before anything went wrong, Andrea was known as quiet, intelligent, and deeply dedicated to her family. She had been a high-achieving nursing student, a disciplined athlete, and someone who avoided conflict. After marrying Rusty Yates in 1993, she devoted her life to raising their children. The couple had 5: Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary. From the outside, it looked like a tightly bonded family living a structured, religious-centered life. But behind that exterior, Andrea was unraveling. After the birth of her 4th child, she experienced severe postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis, a rare but serious mental health condition that can produce hallucinations, paranoia, and disconnection from reality. She was hospitalized multiple times. She attempted suicide twice. Doctors strongly recommended she not have more children due to the severity of her symptoms. Despite this, the family continued expanding, and her responsibilities grew as her mental resilience crumbled. By 2001, her condition had deteriorated dramatically. She began withdrawing socially, became increasingly delusional, and believed she was incapable of caring for her children. She heard internal messages convincing her she was failing them. But instead of receiving continuous long-term treatment, her medical care fluctuated. Medication changes, brief hospital stays, and gaps between evaluations left her without the stability she needed. On June 20, 2001, after Rusty left for work and her mother-in-law was running late to come help, Andrea experienced a complete psychotic break. In a period of profound mental disconnection, she drowned her 5 children in the family's bathtub. Then, in a state of blank shock, she called police and her husband. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She was severely mentally ill and no longer connected to reality in a way healthy minds recognize. The fact pattern was never in dispute. The question was capacity. Was Andrea Yates a cold, calculating killer? Or was she a woman whose untreated psychosis had completely overridden her understanding of right and wrong? Her first trial, in 2002, led to a guilty verdict and a life sentence. But the verdict was built on testimony later proven false. A prosecution expert incorrectly stated that an episode of Law & Order had depicted a similar crime, implying Yates had been inspired by TV. That episode never existed. It was a critical mistake, big enough that in 2005, an appeals court overturned her conviction entirely. That led to the 2006 retrial. This time, jurors were allowed to hear the full extent of Andrea's psychiatric history, the warnings doctors gave, the suicide attempts, the hallucinations, and the documented psychotic episodes. Mental health professionals explained that postpartum psychosis is not simply sadness or stress. It is a medical emergency that can produce beliefs so distorted that the person cannot grasp reality. During the retrial, prosecutors did not dispute that Andrea loved her children. They did not dispute her long history of mental illness. The case turned on one legal question. At the exact moment of the acts, could she understand that what she was doing was wrong? Jurors reviewed hours of expert testimony, medical records, and prior hospitalizations. They saw that Andrea had been in and out of psychiatric care for years and that her psychosis intensified after each childbirth. They learned that she had been taken off a key medication shortly before the tragedy. The evidence pointed toward a complete psychological collapse. On July 26, 2006, the jury delivered the verdict that changed everything: not guilty by reason of insanity. Andrea was not sent to prison. Instead, she was committed to a secure state psychiatric hospital, where she remains. She is not eligible for release unless doctors and a judge agree she is stable, and no professional has recommended release in nearly 2 decades. Her case triggered nationwide discussions about postpartum mental health, the risks of ignoring psychiatric warnings, and the way the legal system treats defendants whose actions result from medical crises rather than malicious intent. Researchers, mental health experts, and advocacy groups frequently cite her case as one of the most important examples of how misunderstood and dangerous untreated perinatal mental illness can be. The Yates tragedy also exposed systemic failures. Andrea's doctors warned multiple times that she needed long-term inpatient care, but she was discharged too early. Medication changes destabilized her. Safety recommendations weren't fully followed. And the family's belief that spiritual strength could overcome psychological illness added pressure Andrea couldn't handle. In the end, it wasn't one mistake. It was a chain of them. Today, her case is widely studied in psychiatry and criminology programs as a cautionary example of what happens when medical, societal, and familial systems all fall short at once. No narrative paints Andrea as a monster. The overwhelming consensus among mental health professionals is that she was a severely ill woman who needed treatment, not punishment. And while this case revolves around mental illness and legal responsibility, the next one is the opposite. A global media frenzy triggered by a man who inserted himself into one of America's most famous unsolved cases and confessed to something he didn't do. Number 6. John Mark Karr. John Mark Karr became one of the most infamous names of 2006, not because he committed a crime, but because he inserted himself into one of the most heavily scrutinized cases in American history, the death of 6-year-old JonBenet Ramsey. His arrest, confession, and rapid unraveling became a worldwide lesson in how media pressure, desperate investigators, and an unstable individual can collide to create a completely false breakthrough. To understand why Karr's confession hit so hard, you need the context. JonBenet Ramsey's case dominated American media from late 1996 onward. High-profile family, unusual circumstances, and years of conflicting theories kept the case alive long after most investigations would have gone cold. Every breakthrough was treated like a national event. Every misstep was amplified. By 2006, 10 years later, the case was still unsolved, still debated, and still generating enormous public interest. Enter John Mark Karr. He was a 41-year-old former schoolteacher living abroad, drifting between jobs, and struggling with personal instability. His life had become increasingly chaotic. He'd developed an obsession with the Ramsey case and had been exchanging emails with a University of Colorado professor who was researching it. Those messages weren't casual comments. They were long, emotional, and disturbing, filled with fantasies and claims that he had been involved. The professor, alarmed, notified law enforcement. Investigators took the messages seriously because of how specific and emotional they were. At a time when the case felt stuck, this was the first person in years claiming direct responsibility. But Karr wasn't living in the United States anymore. He had moved to Thailand, working off and on as an English teacher. So when Thai authorities, working with U.S. officials, tracked him down in Bangkok, it created an international spectacle. On August 15, 2006, Karr was arrested at his apartment. Within minutes, news outlets around the world were running the story. Cameras captured him as he was escorted out by Thai police, calm, confident, and speaking softly about how JonBenet's death was an accident and that he loved her. Those statements, aired globally, made the case appear solved. For a moment, it looked like a decade-long mystery had finally cracked open. But the deeper investigators went, the less sense Karr's version of events made. He provided dramatic details, but none matched the evidence. He claimed he had drugged JonBenet. Toxicology reports showed no drugs. He described events that contradicted the timeline, the autopsy, and the scene. He claimed he had been in Colorado that Christmas, But travel records, phone records, and witnesses all pointed in the opposite direction. The turning point came when DNA evidence arrived. Colorado had preserved biological material from the original investigation. When Carr's DNA was compared, it didn't match. Not even close. It eliminated him as a suspect in a matter of seconds. Once that test came back, the entire confession collapsed. Prosecutors announced there was no evidence tying him to Boulder in 1996, no evidence he'd ever met the Ramsey family, and no evidence he played any role in the case. The emotional, detailed confession was not the account of someone who had lived the event. It was the account of someone who had studied it obsessively and inserted himself into it. After only weeks in custody, Carr was released. He was never charged with anything related to the Ramsey case. His arrest became a cautionary example of how dangerous false confessions can be when paired with global media attention. Investigators later explained that people sometimes confess to notorious crimes for reasons that have nothing to do with guilt, instability, fantasy, desire for attention, or identification with a case. Carr's behavior fit that pattern. But the fallout was enormous. The Ramsey family, who had already endured years of public accusation and tabloid pressure, had to watch the case explode again, only for it to collapse all over. The Boulder District Attorney's Office faced criticism for allowing the arrest to be treated as a breakthrough before evidence confirmed it. Thai authorities were criticized for their handling of Carr's public comments, and the media faced backlash for presenting his claims as fact rather than allegation. After returning to the U.S., Carr continued to draw law enforcement attention for unrelated issues, but he never again became connected to the Ramsey case. His brief moment in the spotlight remains one of the clearest examples of how a false confession can mislead investigators, misinform the public, and add unnecessary trauma to victims' families. The core lesson from the Carr incident is simple. A confession is meaningless without evidence. No matter how emotional, detailed, or sensational it sounds, words alone cannot solve a case. The Ramsey investigation remains officially unsolved, and Carr's involvement is now viewed as a complete dead end. And while this case revolved around a man who claimed responsibility for something he didn't do, the next case returns to an offender whose actions were all too real. A serial killer whose crimes inspired one of the most famous horror franchises in film history, and whose execution in 2006 brought a long-awaited conclusion to a terrifying chapter in Florida. Number 7. Danny Rolling. Danny Rolling's name is forever tied to one of the most terrifying crime sprees in Florida's modern history. By the time he was executed in 2006, he had become known nationwide as the Gainesville Ripper, a man whose 1990 attacks left college communities across the state living in fear. His case is a study in escalation, untreated violence, and the type of offender who doesn't stop until someone physically removes them from society. Rolling grew up in Shreveport, Louisiana, in a household defined by instability and abuse. His father, a police officer, was violent, controlling, and emotionally destructive. Childhood for Rolling wasn't just difficult, it was dehumanizing. He grew up believing he was unwanted, a belief that shaped his adult behavior. School offered no relief, work offered no stability, and every attempt he made to build a normal life eventually collapsed under the weight of his own rage and trauma. By adulthood, he was drifting from state to state, committing armed robberies and various offenses. He had already spent years in and out of prison. But by 1990, Rolling's criminal activity escalated in a direction no one around him anticipated. He arrived in Gainesville, Florida, a city filled with University of Florida students returning for the fall semester. And within days, his behavior turned lethal. Between August 24 and August 27, 1990, Rolling murdered 5 students, Sonia Larson, Christina Powell, Krista Hoyt, Tracy Pauls, and Manny Taboada. The attacks, spread across multiple apartments, sent shockwaves through the university community. Dorms filled with double barriers on doors. Students slept in groups. Parents arrived in caravans to pull their children out of town. Gainesville became a city under siege. What made the case so frightening was Rolling's pattern. He entered apartments late at night, targeted young students, and carried out attacks with a level of anger and planning that investigators recognized immediately. But at the time, police had almost nothing to go on. No direct eyewitnesses, no clear suspect, no public warning signs. Gainesville residents were terrified because no one knew who the killer was or when he would strike again. The break in the case didn't come from a clue found at a crime scene. It came from a robbery. Rolling had attempted to rob a supermarket, fled, and hid in a wooded campsite. When officers eventually found that campsite, they discovered his tools, duct tape, audio diaries, and items linked directly to the murder scenes. But Rolling himself was already in jail for the robbery by the time investigators connected the dots. When confronted with the evidence, Rolling eventually confessed. In 1994, he pleaded guilty to all 5 murders. The sentencing phase showcased the scale of his violence and the pattern that led up to it. Psychologists described a lifetime of trauma that twisted into hatred, instability, and a compulsive drive for dominance. Prosecutors argued that Rolling was fully responsible, fully aware, and fully dangerous. The jury agreed. He was sentenced to death. Rolling did something unusual on the day of his execution. He sang. As the lethal injection process began on October 25, 2006, he sang a hymn in a calm voice. For many, it was a final act of control from a man who had spent his adult life inflicting fear. Before dying, he also confessed in a written note to a triple homicide in Shreveport from 1989, a case long suspected to be connected to him, but never proven until that moment. His crimes didn't fade from public consciousness. Rolling's spree directly inspired the creation of the Scream movie franchise when screenwriter Kevin Williamson, terrified by the Gainesville case as a teen, used it as the foundation for his fictional storyline. Rolling's impact extended far beyond Florida. It permanently shaped conversations about campus safety, investigative coordination, and how quickly a single offender can destabilize an entire community. By the time of his execution, Rolling had become a symbol of the worst-case scenario, an offender who moves silently, strikes randomly, and destroys lives in hours. His case remains one of the most studied crime sprees in U.S. forensic psychology, and while Rolling's actions were confined to a few days in one city, the next case unfolds across multiple states, multiple years, and a legal battle that reshaped sex offender registration nationwide. Number 8 examines a kidnapping case that turned into one of the most consequential federal prosecutions of 2006. Number 8, Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. is a textbook example of what happens when a high-risk offender with a long violent history is released back into society without adequate supervision. By the time he stood trial in 2006, the case had already reshaped federal law, mobilized 2 states, and exposed systemic failures that allowed a dangerous man to walk free long enough to commit one of the most devastating crimes in North Dakota and Minnesota history. Rodriguez grew up in Crookston, Minnesota, and by his early adulthood, he had already developed a clear pattern: abductions, violent assaults, and attacks on women. He wasn't a borderline case. He was the exact type of offender the justice system classifies as high risk to reoffend. Over the years, he was arrested, convicted, and imprisoned multiple times. Each time the charges involved violence, and each time evaluators warned he remained extremely dangerous. Despite that, in May 2003, after serving 23 years for rape, aggravated assault, and kidnapping, Rodriguez was released. He returned to Crookston with almost no meaningful monitoring in place. He had no stable employment, no structured support, and no long-term treatment plan. This set the stage for what would come next. On November 22, 2003, 22-year-old University of North Dakota student Drew Shoden finished a shift at the Victoria's Secret store inside Grand Forks Columbia Mall. She walked to the parking lot while on the phone with her boyfriend. During that call, she said something that instantly raised concern. Okay. It was the last thing anyone heard from her. Seconds later, the line went silent. When she failed to show up for her second job, her co-workers called police. Within hours, it was clear Drew hadn't simply vanished. She had been taken. The search quickly became one of the largest missing persons cases in state history. Volunteers, law enforcement, and federal agents combed highways, fields, and river areas across 2 states. Investigators soon discovered a disturbing detail. Rodriguez had been in the Columbia Mall parking lot that same afternoon. He claimed he was watching the sunset. Cell phone records, witness observations, and timeline reconstruction painted a very different picture. Shortly after Drew disappeared, Rodriguez suddenly left the area and drove back toward Minnesota. 3 days later, police arrested him. Inside his car, they found a knife, receipts, and physical evidence that raised immediate alarms. At his home, investigators found more potentially incriminating items. Yet the most critical piece, Drew herself, was still missing. Her family, along with thousands of volunteers, continued searching through brutal winter conditions for months. It wasn't until April 17, 2004, nearly 5 months later, that Drew's body was discovered in a ravine near Crookston. The location was remote, concealed, and consistent with an offender attempting to hide a victim long enough for evidence to degrade. The discovery confirmed what investigators already suspected. This wasn't a random attack. Rodriguez waited, targeted, abducted, and killed. Because Drew was taken across state lines, the case became federal. Prosecutors charged Rodriguez with kidnapping resulting in death, a capital offense. The trial began in 2006, and the evidence was overwhelming. Fibers, vehicle evidence, cell data, timeline analysis, and Rodriguez's own inconsistent statements. He offered no viable explanation for his whereabouts and gave no reasonable theory that fit the facts. On August 30th, 2006, Rodriguez was convicted. On September 22nd, the jury recommended the death penalty, and on February 8th, 2007, he was formally sentenced to death, the first death sentence connected to North Dakota in over 100 years. Even though North Dakota itself does not have capital punishment, federal law applied because the crime crossed state lines. The legal impact didn't stop at sentencing. Drew's case prompted Congress to pass Drew's Law in 2006, which created the Drew Shoden National Sex Offender Public Registry. For the first time, the country had a unified, publicly accessible federal-level database of high-risk offenders, something many states had resisted for years. Drew's Law exists because Rodriguez should never have been unsupervised in the first place. Years later, appeals began chipping away at the sentence. In 2021, a judge overturned the federal death penalty due to errors in expert testimony and questions about Rodriguez's cognitive evaluations. In 2023, prosecutors withdrew their intent to seek death again. He was resentenced to life without parole. Today, Rodriguez remains in federal custody at USP Coleman in Florida. The core failure in the Rodriguez case wasn't a sudden, unpredictable attack. It was a predictable outcome of releasing a high-risk offender with a documented history of violent behavior and giving him the opportunity to reoffend. Drew Shoden didn't die because Rodriguez was a mystery. She died because warnings were ignored. And while this case exposed national policy failures, the next one centers on a complex Florida prosecution where investigators traced a quadruple homicide back to a businessman who believed he had built the perfect alibi. It's one of the most debated timeline-based convictions of 2006. Number 9. Nelson Serrano. Nelson. Yvonne Serrano wasn't a chaotic offender, a drifter, or someone who acted on impulse. He was a former businessman who believed he could outsmart investigators, construct an airtight alibi, and execute a quadruple homicide without leaving a trace. By October 2006, that belief collapsed in a Florida courtroom, turning Serrano into the central figure of one of the most complex, timeline-driven murder convictions in the state's history. To understand how investigators unraveled this case, you have to understand who Serrano was. In the 1990s, he co-owned Erie Manufacturing in Bartow, Florida, with several business partners, the Dasso and Gonsalves families. The partnerships deteriorated badly. Accusations of financial misconduct, lawsuits, and personal hostility tore the business apart. By 1997, Serrano believed he had been pushed out, cheated, and humiliated. That resentment did not fade. According to prosecutors, it turned into motive. On December 3, 1997, 4 people were murdered execution-style inside Erie Manufacturing. The victims were 69-year-old George Gonsalves, 35-year-old Frank Dasso, 27-year-old Diane Petiso, and her husband, 26-year-old George Petiso. These weren't random killings. They were Serrano's business partners and the daughter and son-in-law of another partner. The crime scene pointed to one clear conclusion. The shooter knew the victims, knew the building, and moved with purpose. But when police went looking for Serrano, he appeared to have a perfect alibi. At the exact time of the murders, his hotel security footage showed him in Atlanta, hours away. That footage became the anchor of his defense for years. Lawyers argued he couldn't be in 2 states at once. What investigators eventually proved was that the hotel footage only showed Serrano at night, after the murders. They reconstructed a precise timeline showing he had flown into Florida using assumed names, rented vehicles under aliases, driven to Bartow, committed the murders, returned to Tampa, flown back to Atlanta, and walked into the hotel at just the right moment to make it look like he'd never left. There were no airport surveillance videos of him arriving under the fake names, but there were airline manifests, seat assignments, rental car records, mileage logs, receipts, and timeline gaps that match the exact window in which the murders occurred. Detectives later said the case didn't hinge on one piece of evidence. It hinged on dozens of small pieces that, when assembled, eliminated coincidence. In 2002, Ecuadorian authorities arrested Serrano, who had dual citizenship, and controversially deported him to the U.S. The legality of that deportation would spark years of appeal arguments, but none of them changed what came next. His 2006 trial lasted months. Jurors watched the prosecution reconstruct the timeline minute by minute. They saw how Serrano used aliases like Juan Agaccio and John White to move through airports undetected. They heard about the business disputes, the lawsuits, the financial motives, and the personal bitterness that had been building for years. Serrano insisted he was framed. He claimed the timeline was impossible and the evidence circumstantial. But the pattern was too tight, the motive too strong, and the alibi too engineered. In October 2006, the jury returned its verdict, guilty of all 4 murders. The vote for guilt was unanimous, but the vote recommending death was 9-3, which was legally permissible under Florida law at the time. On June 26, 2007, Serrano was sentenced to death by lethal injection for each of the 4 murders. For Polk County, It was one of the most significant cases in its history. 4 victims, a complex interstate investigation, and a defendant who believed he had created the perfect timeline. Years later, Florida changed its death penalty rules to require unanimous jury recommendations. That legal shift invalidated many older death sentences, including Serrano's. Before he could be resentenced, Serrano died of natural causes on August 8, 2024, at age 85, after nearly 2 decades on death row. His case remains a masterclass in investigative reconstruction. No confession, no eyewitnesses, no single smoking gun. Just a carefully unraveled alibi that collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. And now the final case in this sequence takes us out of the U.S. entirely, to Russia, where a man known as the chessboard killer attempted to map his crimes onto a 64-square board, turning one of Moscow's city parks into a hunting ground for over a decade. Number 10. Alexander Pichushkin. Alexander Pichushkin, known worldwide as the chessboard killer, is one of the most prolific and methodical serial murderers in modern Russian history. By the time he was arrested in 2006, Moscow investigators discovered they were dealing with a man who didn't just kill, he kept score. His goal was explicit: 1 victim for every square on a chessboard. 64 in total, and he fully intended to reach it. To understand how he operated for more than a decade, you have to understand the environment. Much of Pichushkin's life revolved around Bitsa Park, a massive wooded area in southern Moscow. Dense, secluded, and filled with long walking paths, the park became the ideal place for someone to commit repeated violence without attracting attention. For years, unexplained deaths and disappearances were occurring there, but without a clear pattern, authorities struggled to connect them. Pichushkin's early life showed the seeds of what he would become. He was quiet, intelligent, and socially isolated. As a child, he suffered a head injury that reportedly changed his behavior, making him more impulsive and detached. His grandfather later introduced him to chess, the one activity Pichushkin excelled at. But behind that structured game was a young man who had difficulty connecting with people. Chess became less about strategy and more about control. He committed his first known murder in 1992, targeting a classmate he'd lured into Bitsa Park. From that point on, the pattern became remarkably consistent. Pichushkin sought out individuals who were isolated, vulnerable, or unlikely to be reported missing quickly. Many were older men, some were homeless, and others were people he met casually near local shops or outside the metro. His method was disturbingly simple. He often invited victims for a walk or a drink in the park, presenting himself as friendly or harmless. Once inside the wooded areas, he attacked them. Many victims were struck on the head with a hammer, a method chosen not just for lethality, but because it left him in control. In some cases, he tampered with evidence in ways that misled investigators. For years, these deaths were ruled accidents, suicides, or unconnected homicides. Few people realized a single offender was responsible. Pichushkin took advantage of that confusion. Meanwhile, at home, he kept a chessboard with 62 of the 64 squares filled, each square representing a victim. This wasn't fantasy. It was his private record. His downfall began with one victim who didn't fit the pattern, 36-year-old supermarket employee Marina Moskalyova. Unlike previous victims, she left a note for her son stating she was meeting with Pichushkin. When she failed to return, her son immediately alerted police. Investigators checked Moscow metro surveillance and found footage of Marina walking with Pichushkin shortly before her death. That single piece of evidence broke the case open. On June 16, 2006, police arrested Pichushkin. Once in custody, he didn't deny anything. In fact, he confessed with pride, claiming the police stopped him too early. He admitted to killing more than 60 people and stated that reaching 64, the number of squares on a chessboard, was symbolic. One victim per square. A completed board. A completed legacy. Prosecutors charged him with 49 murders and 3 attempted murders. The cases with the strongest forensic evidence. In court, Pichushkin was cold, articulate, and emotionless. He didn't plead insanity, didn't blame his childhood, and didn't express remorse. Instead, he explained his crimes with logic, describing how committing murder made him feel powerful and alive. He contrasted himself with other serial killers, claiming he was superior because he killed not for lust or rage, but for the act itself. On October 24, 2007, he was convicted. His sentence was the harshest allowed under Russian law, life imprisonment, with the first 15 years in solitary confinement. That means 15 years of isolation, followed by permanent incarceration in a special regime prison. Pichushkin is currently serving that sentence at Russia's Black Dolphin Penal Colony, one of the most secure and psychologically demanding prisons in the country. What makes Pichushkin's case so disturbing isn't just the number of victims. It's the structure, the intent, and the long-term planning. He didn't kill impulsively. He killed with purpose. He viewed life and death through a mechanical lens, reducing human beings to markers on a board, a level of dehumanization that even seasoned investigators described as chilling.